Episode 30 of the Page One podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco. Episode 30, Tarek.
Episode 30? What a milestone.
I know, it's almost as old as you.
I'm actually only 21.
Yeah.
I just look a lot older.
It's about half my age. Not really, I'm joking. No,
it's a third of his age.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks very much for tuning in to the Page One podcast, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing process, their work, and really just try and get as many hints and tips as we can from all these great authors that we've had on the podcast, like Sarah Pimbra, David Baldacci, Andy McNabb, Mark Billingham. So many great authors have come on this podcast, and screenwriters and video game writers and comic writers. So please do check out the past episodes. Hope you're all doing okay this week, of course, because we continue in the lockdown in the UK, and I think in across most of the world at this point.
How has your last week of lockdown been, Marco?
Yeah, I've been in the house, which is what you're meant to do, I think.
It's still so strange, isn't it? How, I think we've reached that point with we've all been working from home, obviously, for the past 3 weeks, and the first week is a bit of a novelty-ish. You're kind of like, oh, this is nice to get a little lie-in and put the dinner on, and then by week 3 you're kind of like, this is just, it's kind of worn off a little bit now, isn't it?
I mean, yeah, it's a bit like in my day job, I actually work from home quite a lot anyway, so it wasn't that massive a change at first, except that I had the rest of the family here as well. But like you say, it's the fact that you can't go out and do these things that is it does start to weigh on you. Just even to go to the pub for a drink or meet some friends.
It's all the little
like
moments when you're like, oh, it'd be nice to go and I can't see that person, or I can't go out for dinner, or I can't get a takeaway.
And we can't even record this in person.
Exactly,
obviously, we're doing it over the internet. But anyway, we're rambling on about that too much, and the whole point of this is to help distract you for an hour. So
exactly.
We've got a great distraction for you this week. Great author. Who is it, Tarek?
We do indeed. His name is Struan Murray, and he is a new author who's been, it's one of these things where it's an author who's been working for a long time, but his first book's just out, Orphans of the Tide. It's a fantastic read. It's a dark and kind of gothic kids fantasy novel. Northern Lights comparison's been made. That's that kind of feel to it, I think. Yeah,
it's been compared to, amazingly compared to Philip Pullman, which isn't bad for your debut novel.
Fantastic comparison to be made.
And I've been reading the book to my daughters, and they're really enjoying it, and I'm really enjoying it as well. So it's one of these books that is aimed at kids, but that adults can enjoy as well, because it does have that dark side to it that it's not all twee and sweet, which some kids' books, having read a lot of them, it can be. So no, it's really good. Really recommend it, and it was a really great chat we had with Struan.
Yeah, it was. He was a really nice guy, and I think, like so many authors we've chatted to before, the process that he took to get the book out there is quite long, and it's all about the perseverance. That he's written. I think it was a couple of the book. The final book is in no way resembles the book that he started with, and it just shows you that the most people's first books they write is not the book that finally.
Yeah, and we actually chat to him about that, about knowing. How do you know? When you're first writing a book, I think. You pour everything into that first book, and you want to say, this is my book. So it's a difficult thing for someone that hasn't been published and everything to say, right, no, I spent all this time writing this, but I'm just going to put it to the side and I'm going to start something else. I mean, I think the first thing he wrote, I think he tells us, is an adult sci-fi book, and then he's now obviously changed quite dramatically what he's writing, but this is where he's found his voice. So I think going through that process helps you find your voice and everything.
Yeah, and it is a skill in knowing not only how much to put in, but what to take out of something. Because I think, as you say, you're right. When it's your first book, the temptation is there to put everything into it, hold nothing back, and you overstuff it. And I think it's important to know you want to make it as sleek and as slim as possible, and just the bare bones that to carry you through without being laden down with all this crap you don't need. And that's hard to know what to take out.
Definitely. Well, he, like I say, he chats to us about that. He chats about the value of writing courses, and he also had an interesting experience where he interned at a few agencies, so got to know the publishing industry and people in the publishing industry, which obviously helped as well. So it's a really great chat, really interesting. So I hope you enjoy it. We'll get on with the chat, but first we're going to have a quick little ad for our writer's notebook that we've designed. And then after that, we'll get into the interview with Struan. And after that, we'll be back with a bit more chat.
Perfect. See you then.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Did you always want to be a writer?
I think I was always very big on sort of telling stories. I used to make my own comic book when I was at primary school. I used to sell it. Used to force parents to buy it for like 20 pence. And it was because I had a real addiction to Pokemon cards.
Right.
I must be like eight or nine. And so, but they were so expensive that I would sort of make my own. And they just looked like flimsy and rubbish. But so I decided, okay, I need a money making scheme. Making my own comic book and selling it to parents. But yeah, and then I think it was when I was about 11 or 12 and I wrote this really bloodthirsty, it's about like a detective in the kind of vein of like Dick Tracy,
right.
Kind of, but really like just weirdly bloodthirsty for a child. And I remember, and I thought it was kind of crap, but then I showed it to my stepmom's brother, who was this real like American kind of classical, like almost like a cowboy, or at least I thought he was as a kid anyway.
Uh-huh.
And he just laughed and laughed reading it. I think he just found it so funny that this 11-year-old kid. The scene where the detective like kills a guy in a bar and then drinks the guy's Bloody Mary and then leaves. And yeah, I think it was that kind of, wow, this person really likes this story. And I think that was it was almost that kind of buzz of like, wow, I really like this. But then, I think I didn't really write much at all until I got to university, and my day job became going into the lab and dealing with the pernicious sort of nature of experiments, which are so often don't go your way. And when you are a scientist, you get very emotionally invested in your science and in your experiments, because and you fall into this trap of kind of equating your own sort of self-worth with the success of your own experiments. And so as a coping mechanism for that, I realized I needed something else to kind of be emotionally attached to. And so I decided to pick up storytelling again. But it was like my dirty secret for years. I didn't tell anyone, actually. It felt sort of shameful almost, which I'm sure is something that lots of writers can attest to. And then I think it was one of my best friends he came out as a writer to me, and I was like, oh wow, so am I. That's what kind of blew my mind. And then I think I shared something of mine that I'd written to him, and he loved it, and that was the kind of, then I felt brave enough to start going to writing groups. And although actually the first time I went to a writing group, I genuinely locked myself in a toilet for about half an hour beforehand, thinking I was going to be sick, just sort of collecting this manuscript I was going to take in to have them read. And just reading it and rereading it, thinking, wow, this is rubbish. But
that's a feeling that I think, I would definitely be in the same position if I sharing that thing that you've been writing, you've been spending all this time writing yourself, but then actually giving it to someone, especially if it's someone that you don't know, to judge it is a huge step. And I think it's something that a lot of aspiring writers struggle with, I think. But was it a worthwhile thing to do in the end?
Oh, absolutely. I think mainly because it suddenly made it feel real to me. It was no longer this sort of ephemeral cloud in my head. It was, a tangible thing that other people spoke about. It also really helped, again, I think, like I was saying with science, like with writing, you sometimes forget that it's just a story and that it's not a reflection of you in some way. And you fear what people might think, because you think if they don't like your story, then they don't like you. Just to hear people talk about my work at one of these groups in a very kind but quite kind of detached way, as if they really are just talking about this story. They're not talking about you. It helped me to realize, okay, my stories are not me, and so I shouldn't be judged when people have constructive criticisms about my own work.
And also, I'd imagine going from science to creative writing, you're taught to write in science, but it's a really specific type of writing. It's really kind of clinical and papers, reports and stuff, and to switch from that into creative is such a different knack, and that must have been quite a difficult change, I would have thought. Or a refreshing change, perhaps?
A what, sorry?
Like a refreshing change, maybe like you don't really get that creative outlet in science.
Yeah, it is. It's refreshing in some ways. It's, the freedom to write whatever you want is wonderful at first, and then just terrifying.
Fair point. Yeah. Okay.
A whole other kind of terror, because science, like you have real things to talk about, and that helps. And your ultimate goal is clarity. You're just trying to be as clear as you can and get a point across in as few words as possible. And then with creative writing, it's a thing in your head that you're trying to get out onto the page, and so it can be a different sort of torment. But it is a nice change. I do enjoy switching from one to the next.
And I read that did you take part in the Curtis Brown creative course, and how did that help?
I think that was a really important thing that I did, actually. I think the best thing about it was kind of similar to what I said before. It was seeing the publishing industry and realizing that this is just a real industry of people. Again, because before that they were just this frightening non-entity, this kind of frightening invisible force to be reckoned with, who would pick up your manuscript and just laugh at it and then throw it away. So it helped just meet people from the publishing industry and see that they're just people and that they really care about writing and reading and that they're very passionate. And it also, I got to meet a whole load of different writers, kind of aspiring writers like myself, of all different from all different kind of walks of life and ages, which was, again, a very important thing for me, I think, just to see, okay, this is how these people think. And their feedback was just amazing.
And when you were there, like, how does the course work? Were you working on what became Orphans of the Tide when you were doing that course, or
no,
was it
actually,
something different?
So I was working on the first novel that I ever wrote, which is actually an adult sci-fi novel,
right?
Trying to kind of get across the strangeness of what it's like to be in a science lab, and kind of taking it all to extremes. But it was very, very different thing from what I ended up writing, Orphans of the Tide. But still, I mean, it was still hugely helpful. I think I had also kind of fallen into the trap of thinking, I have to write something that's like worthy and artistic and like groundbreaking, rather than just writing the story I really just wanted to write all along, which turns out was a children's fantasy novel. And so it did also kind of help me reckon with that and think, actually, I'd rather just write the kind of story that I would have liked to read as a kid. And
we were discussing that with one of our other guests, which is that I think there can be that sort of pressure, or you can sometimes feel that pressure to write, that you have to write something that aspires to be a Booker Prize winner or some sort of great literary fiction. But if it's not true to what you enjoy reading, then that'll often come through in the writing itself. When I write, I want to find out what's going to happen in the story, because I'm invested and interested in the story. So it turns into a sort of story of the type of books that I read. So, I mean, so what made you think, or what was the decision-making process that said, right, I'm going to stop the adult sci-fi and I'm going to start writing the children's fantasy? When did that happen?
I think I needed a break. The sci-fi novel was my first ever novel, and I think I had got so caught up in it. And I think this often happens with people with their first novels. They just so want it to work, and they will, and it's a proving ground. You're learning all these things for the first time about how you write a novel, and it's your first bicycle, right? Like you're just you're throwing everything at it that you have, like creatively, every kind of clever idea that you think you've ever had. You're trying to distill it into this one novel, and so it just ended up being this big mess. And I think there's stuff in there that I like, and that maybe I'll revisit in 5 years or 10 years time. But it had become too bound up in my head with, the idea of writing your first great novel. And I just realized I need to put it away just to have some breathing space. And I was able to start a new novel with much more kind of clarity and kind of less clutter in my head.
Yeah. And once you'd finished doing the book, did you have an agent at that point? I know the Curtis Brown course is quite big, and does that lead you to getting an agent at all, or is that a stepping stone on that path?
Yeah, it can. And in fact, in my case, it did land me an agent, although by a slightly circuitous route. So I was doing my PhD at the time of the Curtis Brown course, and I was lucky enough. Part of my PhD involved a 3-month internship. And I was a bit sneaky because it was ostensibly supposed to be something to do with science. But I thought, here's my chance. Why don't I go and I work in the publishing industry for 3 months? and I actually went and did some internships at literary agencies.
Okay.
Wow. Okay. Cool.
And so I live in Oxford normally, but I moved to London for 3 months. I was able to sort of crash on a friend's couch, and I went to literary agencies by day, and then I went to the Curtis Brown course by night. So I was just kind of living and breathing the publishing industry for 3 months, which was such an amazing opportunity. So what I did was, kind of towards the end of the Curtis Brown course, I had kind of I'd written this other children's fantasy novel, which was supposed to be the part of a trilogy. Ironically, it was called The Orphan in the Fire. So Orphans of the Tide is not a title I came up with.
Okay.
It was,
Okay, cool.
So happened that it was almost the same as my previous fantasy novel. And I sent that off to one of the literary agencies that I'd worked for because they'd expressed an interest. And then they offered me representation off the back of that. And they were really great and so supportive, but I think ultimately they'd never really done children's publishing before. They'd never really dealt with children's writers. And so I think I made the difficult choice further down the line that I needed someone who really knew children's writing. Because that first children's fantasy, it went out to publishers. My agent sent it to publishers for about a year, I think, which was a very lot. And I had no idea of what the timescales were supposed to be. So I thought a year was just the kind of the norm, and it can take that long. But I was checking my Gmail every 20 minutes. I got really obsessive about it.
That's a long year to wait, I imagine.
Yeah, and in the end, we did actually get a meeting with a publisher, a big publisher, and I was so excited. I cut short. I'd gone backpacking, and I cut that short, and I came back for this meeting thinking, this is it. This is the one. This is it's all going to happen. And I had this hour-long meeting that for the first half hour was just them telling me how much they liked my book. Like, well, this is just great.
This is good, yeah.
And then at halfway through, this editor paused and then said, but we're not going to buy it because it's part of a trilogy and no one's buying trilogies at the moment.
Oh.
And we need you to go away and rewrite it as a standalone book. Or write some standalone book. And so I came away from that pretty desolate. And it took quite a while to kind of piece myself back together. But I did end up writing a standalone fantasy novel, which is what Orphans of the Tide became.
And was that linked at all to the first one, or was it a completely different story then?
Has some idea, some of the same ideas. The first one was also set in this isolated city, a kind of post-apocalyptic city, but really like a kind of gothic fantasy city. And again, it was an important kind of proving ground. It was an important kind of training in figuring out how to write a fantasy novel that I wanted to write.
That sounds quite hard, though. Having gone from the high of a meeting in the first half hour to then get told to start from scratch, getting something new. That's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and it got harder because I then wrote that. I wrote Orphan. Well, it was called The Vessel originally, Orphans of the Tide, and I still had the same agent, and we sent that out to a load of publishers. And I think it was another year of waiting. And it just wasn't landing. So what I failed to say was actually that originally it was a YA novel. It became a middle grade children's novel at a later stage. But originally it was YA. And I think for that reason it wasn't quite working because I think it was a YA that wanted to be a middle grade children's novel.
So what's...
I haven't figured that out yet.
What aspects of it did you change then to change that audience?
In many ways, I didn't have to change all that much, except to say, it was some quite superficial things. It was just a rebranding. It was just saying, this is now a great novel.
Right. Okay.
To make it fit those specifications, the word count had to come down. So I had to cut about a third.
Right.
Okay. Is there violence or swearing? Does that kind of thing have to get shifted about if you've got?
Yeah, there was never any swearing actually, and the violence. To be honest, the violence has sort of stayed. What violence there is. There was a very there was a romance that, in hindsight, I realized was completely not working, and should never have been there in the first place. But I just felt like this is a YA novel that has to have a romance.
Yeah.
And so I'm so glad that that's not there anymore, because it really allowed the novel to breathe in other ways, because it was no longer constrained by the kind of plot structure that a romance imposes. And I mean, there was some of the more drier kind of, there was some more political stuff in there, almost kind of Game of Thrones-y that went. So, and it was a publisher again who I met with. They were quite frank from the beginning, saying that they weren't ready to buy it yet, unlike the previous publisher, thankfully. But they did say that it should be middle grade. It should be YA. And at the time, I was like, it can't be middle grade. How could I possibly do that? But then what happened was I submitted the novel actually on my girlfriend's advice, so I'm pretty indebted to her for this. I submitted it to a competition called the Bath Novel Award. And thinking that, and by this point I'd actually abandoned all hope of this novel ever getting published. I just thought, okay, this is just not going to happen. And I'd actually started writing other children's novels by then.
So in the YA format at this point, when it was
still in a YA format, yeah. I decided, because I felt like this novel couldn't be middle grade. I tried writing some other middle grade novels to see what it was like, to see if it suited me. And I in a crazy kind of flurry, I wrote 3 middle grade novels in the year.
Wow.
Which I wish I could recapture that level of productivity, because I don't think I've ever been that productive with my writing. And I submitted all 3 and The Vessel, which would become Orphans of the Tide, to the Bath Novel Award. And then ironically, it was The Vessel that got shortlisted of those. And then it went on to win. And it was because of getting shortlisted, actually, that Curtis Brown reached out to me.
Oh, okay.
And so someone who, Anna Davis, who is in charge of Curtis Brown Creative, reached out to me and said, look, would you like me to forward this on to Stephanie Thwaites, who's one of our children's agents. And kind of that's where it all kind of kicked off, because Stephanie back to me almost immediately to say that she really liked it, but then, and I hadn't told her any of the history, but she said, I think it needs to be a middle grade novel.
Right. Okay.
And so when she said that, I was like, right, well, she must be, like, enough people have said it now. But unlike Stephanie, though, had a very clear vision of how to make it middle grade, which is not something that anyone else had offered me. And I just thought, wow, this is someone who really knows what she's talking about.
But the whole success with the Bath Award, even to get shortlisted at first, that must have been such kind of vindication almost for the amount of work and time we'd spent on this book.
Yeah.
Finally, it was getting recognised as something.
Great. I went to the award ceremony not knowing that I was going to win it. So when they announced my name, it was really quite something. Cause,
that's awesome.
And when the novel came out a month ago, and it's been 5 years, I think, since I first started writing it. So it's been a very long journey, but and it might be maybe 10 years since I first started writing novels.
But I mean, it's received huge plaudits already, even though it's just been out for a month. It's got great reviews. It's even been compared to Philip Pullman stuff. I mean, it must be beyond your wildest expectations about how well it's
it is. No, I still can't quite wrap my head around it. Yeah, I mean, the best reviews, to be honest, have been like parents on Amazon just saying that their child wanted to stay up all night talking about it. That's that sort of thing, because ultimately you don't care what adults think. The adults are the gatekeepers. You have to get them on board, but it's the children whose opinions matter. So it's just been so nice to finally be able to know that children like this book.
Yeah, I'm reading it to both of my daughters at the moment, and they're loving it.
Amazing.
They had a question for you, but you've kind of already answered it, which is why is it called Orphans of the Tide? That was the question they had. Why is it called Orphans of the Tide? Where did that the name change come from then?
Yeah, so it was. I mean, the vessel is what it was always called in my head, but I also knew that it probably wouldn't be published under that title, because it's not. It's a title that only makes sense once you've actually read the book, and therefore it doesn't really draw you in. And when we sold the novel to Penguin, that was one of the first things we had to do, was come up with the new title. And I think we did it in like a week. And it was mostly me just sending them bad idea after bad idea, and very politely kind of saying, we think that might be a little bit, too dry or whatever. And then I think someone, I don't actually know who it was that came up with Orphans of the Tide. It was someone at Penguin. But it was, to me, it was such a weird coincidence that it sounded like the title of my other fantasy novel. And it just sort of stuck. And I think, and also a few people complained that it was too dark, which I thought meant it was just right. If it was just at the cusp of being a bit too dark, because that's kind of what I was always. There's lots in this book where I was constantly trying to push to see just how kind of dark I was allowed to be with it, and then being reined in, and finding that kind of like middle ground where it made my editor a bit uncomfortable. And in fact, I got to listen to the audiobook being recorded, a few months ago. And I was sat there with my editor listening to it. And there was this one particular sequence being read out, and my editor did turn to me and said, like, I can't believe I let you keep that in. That was wonderful. That was my like, yes, okay.
No, it definitely has that feel of, like you said before, sort of a gothic, dark fantasy, almost like a rundown kind of world. But certainly, I know I'm not the target audience at all, but from when I was a kid, that was the sort of book that I would have loved to read. That sort of, it puts you in that world, and it's a very clear world that you're able to see very quickly, I think.
And when you first started to write this book, where did the idea for it come, and I suppose where do you get your ideas from, and how do you find the idea in the first place?
Yeah, it was kind of a convergence of different story ideas, where I was trying to kind of simultaneously come up with different novels in my head, and then realized that actually they would work. That it was just one novel with these different ideas in it. So I'd been off backpacking. I'd finished my PhD, and I decided, I didn't really know what to do next. So I kind of got what limited savings I had left and went off backpacking. And I was in Stockholm in Sweden, and they have this big museum called the Vasa Museum, which is just literally like a big old ship with this building around it, and it's by the sea. And I became kind of fixated on the idea of a world there where, like, the buildings kind of rise out of the sea, and the city is much a part, is really just a part of the sea, and the ships kind of just, you find ships just kind of moored inside cathedrals and things like that. And then combined that with, I'd been like, I don't know how it happened, but I ended up on just watching YouTube videos of whales exploding.
Too much to drink that night.
But I just thought, wow, okay, it's whales, if they die on land, very sadly, they just sort of swell up as they decay, and if you don't cut them open, they explode.
Oh, I didn't know that. Is that like some kind of gas buildup?
Yeah, it's really cool. I just thought, wow, what a perfect way to start a children's novel. And I thought, well, okay, well, then again, I got kind of, struck by this image of a whale on a church rooftop, because I just thought, well, there's so many questions there. And I find when I'm trying to write a story, I start with a strange image that demands answers. Why is the whale on a rooftop? Why is the church under the water? How are people going to react to this whale in an interesting way? And that's how I came up with this idea for this very like superstitious place where a whale on a roof would be seen as this kind of like grim omen. And then, so really so much of the DNA of the story came from just those moments of being like, well, why, what is this whale doing here? And then the final kind of, ingredient was that I'd been tinkering with this idea of writing a kind of historical fantasy novel about Da Vinci.
Right.
Only have it so that actually Da Vinci was really a woman who had to conceal her gender because no one would take her seriously at that time. And my agent loved at the time, she loved the idea and thought I needed to do this, but partly I thought, actually, I'm not the right person to be telling this story. And also, I don't know, it just wasn't quite resonating with me enough. But I really liked the idea of having this young female inventor who was sort of brilliant, but not really recognized because she lives in this patriarchal society. So I had her in the back of my mind whilst I was thinking about all this, and thought, well, she's the person who would know to cut the whale open. So yeah, it was really this kind of convergence of ideas.
And it's also got, I suspect that some of the comparisons that have been made to, especially to someone like Philip Pullman, is it has this idea, or it seems to have this idea of, a city that's unquestioningly following a sort of dogma and authority about something, but there is the main characters, Ellie and her sister and stuff, are the ones that start to question that. I mean, was that a theme that you wanted to get in the book, or was it just that came to it as you were creating the story? I
think it did. I think it was my intention, coming from a slightly different direction. I mean, to me, what I was kind of modeling it on, like, when you write a fantasy or a sci-fi story, you want your kind of fantasy kind of conceits to explore some real world phenomenon. And at the time, I think I was thinking a lot about like mental health and the stigmas that surround people who are depressed or have some kind of sort of mental health issue that means that they might be kind of shunned or just not really listened to, or even seen as potentially dangerous. And that's really what I was trying to kind of tap into, is this idea of, okay, this person who is the vessel, they are like infected by the enemy, they have this evil inside them. And so, on the face of it, it kind of seems, it's like a witch hunt, which again, was definitely something I did tap into. But to make it feel kind of human and to really tap into that sort of emotional sort of core, I wanted it to be a story about, people who are struggling with some kind of darkness inside them. And that same darkness means that other people will view them as dangerous and shun them and kind of force them to hide their part of themselves. And also the shame that comes from having to kind of hide this secret and not be able to tell anyone and just letting it kind of fester inside.
And how do you, when you come to sit down to actually start writing, how much planning do you do prior to that point? Do you like to plan things out in advance, or do you kind of just be a bit of a pantser and just see what happens?
I think I'm sort of a bit of both. It kind of comes in fits and starts. I will write until I'm with as much kind of material as I feel I have in my head, and then I'll inevitably hit a wall and be like, right, I just don't know what happens next. And then I'll take a step back and I'll try and look at the overarching story and see where I'm going next. But I do find it hard to see too far ahead. I tend to know how the story will end. Although actually I didn't with Orphans. I really didn't know how it would end. But usually I do. But yeah, this one I did not. And that was a bit of a hard process trying to figure out how this story ends.
And I read as well that when you write your first draft, you enjoy writing in long form, by hand. Is that something you do for all your stories? And then what is the process from taking that to presumably then for the second draft or whatever you'll put it onto a PC?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I didn't write this way. I feel like it would be much more efficient, but I have to write it by hand first. Otherwise, I start editing already whilst I'm trying to write. Obviously, as well, if you're on your computer, it's much easier to check the internet. So I just find that there's something satisfying about in terms of actually when you're writing, having something to show for it that's physical and real. And then when I transfer that into the computer, when I transcribe it, it goes through this editing process without me even thinking about it, where I'm just moving commas around and changing words that aren't working. And then, when I'm writing it by hand, I'll shove it liberally, just say like, she looked at X, she felt X, there's just placeholders. But because I'm writing and there's forward momentum, I don't stop to think, okay, well, what's that going to be? But often by the time I come back to it, I already know what it is because my brain's had time to kind of sort it out.
I mean, because that's, some other people that we've spoken to have sort of said that they'll, every day when they sit down to write, they'll sort of reread the last section of whatever they've written, and then they might make changes to that, but presumably you can't do that in long form. You just have to kind of plow on, as it were. Unless
I mean, what I often do is I'll write long form at the end of the day, and then the following morning I'll transcribe it.
Okay.
And that often means that it means I starting with something where I don't even have to think. All I'm doing is transcribing it. But whilst I'm transcribing it, I'm getting back into the mode of thinking about writing, thinking about the story. And so then I'll be able to very easily just carry on straight back into first drafting again.
Yeah. Well, and I suppose it means you kind of almost have two drafts done by the time you finish.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how many drafts do you tend to do before you think? And I suppose also, how do you know when a book is finished? Is another question we've often.
I mean, I think now it's very different because now I have an editor who I can work with, and so I don't have to worry so much about giving them something that feels a little bit rough at the edges, because I know I just need to show them what the bones of it are, so that they can tell me, this is the right direction you're going in.
Yeah.
I think before I had an editor, it was it was a case of trying to polish it until I just thought I couldn't improve it any further. And, using, taking it to writers groups, showing it to friends. My girlfriend is also a novelist, so we help each other all the time with our writing. So I think having other people to kind of be like, this is ready.
Yeah.
Is a big.
Yeah, because you can definitely, I think, especially when you're without that input from a sort of professional editor or something, I know I'm guilty of it, of just, you keep going back to it and you can keep saying, oh, there's a bit here that I could fix, or maybe it would be better if that happened here or whatever. And you can keep revising it and revising it and revising it, and it can be a bit of a difficult step to step away from it and give it to someone else at that point.
Yeah, and I think, it's really tough. You have to know when just to say this is fine. But I think sometimes I find with myself, but also talking to other authors, kind of aspiring writers, that you will be. Sometimes you'll be, the time taken on a redraft should sort of diminish with each draft. But sometimes I would do things just like, right, I need to completely start from the ground up again. And sometimes it's so hard, because sometimes that is what you need to do. But I think when you're one of the great things you have to learn, and no one can really tell you how to do it, is how to respond to feedback, and to what lengths to listen to feedback. And because I have seen people, and I think I've been guilty of myself, just completely revamp their novel on the basis of a single piece of criticism that maybe was said without too much thought, and I think for me that was one of the biggest hurdles, was how to deal with feedback and how to know when to respond or when to ignore.
And it's hard because no one, to touch on what we said at the very start, you put yourself out there, and then being told this bit doesn't work, you change that bit. It's hard to hear that sometimes. You kind of think, well, no, or you think, oh God, I need to change everything, and it can, as you say, it can spark a massive revamp, and it's trying to follow that is difficult.
I think it can sometimes, I think as with all these things, there's merit in sort of letting it sit there for a while. If someone makes a comment, if someone gives you some feedback, rather than reacting immediately, because your instinct then is either to think that what they're saying is absolutely correct and throw everything that you've done away, or immediately push back against it. But in fact, sometimes if you let time pass, you can sort of see the merit of what they're saying, or say, well, actually that's not right because whatever. So I mean, Orphans has been a huge success, and is it? I've not finished it yet. Is there plans for a sequel? Is it a book that could continue?
Yeah, the sequel comes out in a year.
Oh, perfect!
In 11 months now, actually.
Awesome.
I'm still working on it. So it's it's with all that's going on at the moment, it's a little bit hard to be creative. But I'm kind of in the process of doing the second draft at the moment, which is proving quite a big redraft. But like you said, actually, when I got the feedback, I basically just did nothing for a few weeks, just to let my editor's feedback kind of filter in. And it's amazing what your kind of creative brain will do when you're not really actively engaging with it. Like I came back in a few weeks, and my brain was just like, right, this is how to do it. This is what you need to do. Rather than kind of stressing over it and sitting at my desk and actively thinking like, what on earth am I going to do? It's quite remarkable. But so the sequel comes out, and then there's hopes for a third book, so it will be a trilogy.
Awesome. And am I right in saying that when you got the book deal, it was for 2 books? And I'm assuming that it was, and I'm assuming that means you've then got a bunch of deadlines you have to hit for the next book, which you don't even started yet, and suddenly you've spent 5 years on one book and you've got a year.
it was so nuts, especially since ironically, I wrote this book not to be part of a trilogy because I'd been told by publishers they weren't buying trilogies, but now this is going to be a trilogy. And I've spent so long kind of dreaming about the chance to write a trilogy, because every fantasy author dreams of writing a trilogy, right? And so it's been quite exciting now to think about the particular challenges of actually how do you write a series of books. How do you make each one sort of stand alone by itself while still being part of a larger whole, and also be different enough while still maintaining the kind of essence of the predecessor.
So, I mean, did you you wrote this book as a standalone, which presumably means that your story that you had in your head was a complete story, but now it's becoming a trilogy. So did you always have in the back of your head, well, if this continued, these things could happen, kind of a thing? Or did that pose a problem when you suddenly had to tell more stories?
I think despite my best efforts, there was always stuff left over unfinished, because part of me still wanted it to continue. So there was always enough left by the end to continue on to something more. And yeah, I mean, what's very strange now is writing this sequel whilst getting kind of feedback and reviews on the first book, and people telling me like, oh, I love this particular part, or I love this character, and then me having to bite my tongue and be like, well, that character is actually not in the sequel. And also it's hard not to let their kind of the things people like shape how I'm writing the second book.
Yeah.
And not just to give them more of what they have already said they enjoy. So it's quite hard to kind of enjoy the feedback whilst also trying not to let it affect your writing process.
I mean, I've said this before in the podcast, but I mean, it's the problem that I think George R.R. Martin must have with the remaining Game of Thrones books, because the story, people now think they know the whole story, so that's probably why it's very difficult for him to sit down and motivate himself to finish these books.
When you've got everyone under the sun telling you what the plot twists are going to be, and what
there's no drive there anymore, is there really?
Yeah, and do you just go ahead with your intended plan, or do you try and like switch things up just to kind of you don't
know, you'll always be compared to the TV show. You'll always be compared with the choices you made and they made, and characters ended up, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's sort of done the best. What he's done seems quite smart, which is basically just to let the TV show run its course. And then let the hype kind of go down a bit, so that he can then step back in and tell his own story.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And once, so you've got the trilogy, ideally, and then once that's done, have you got any plans to go back to your sci-fi novel, you think, or would you like to?
No, I think because that's an adult novel, I think I have to really. I think I have to establish myself as a. And I think I do prefer writing children's stories, so I think that's what I'm going to do until as long as they'll let me, basically. So I have a couple of ideas, which are already written really in first and drafts, which now that I have
the last ones that you sent in.
Yeah, one of them is, although it's quite different now. But yeah, two of them, which I think are kind of quite unique in their kind of concept. And one of them is actually a children's sci-fi novel. But I think it has quite a lot of, kind of relevance at the moment.
Cool. Children's sci-fi is not really is that a big market? I mean, that's the kind of thing I would like to see more of. I mean, I remember as a kid, I think a lot of sci-fi I read as a kid was probably more adult sci-fi. I don't remember there being a lot of children's sci-fi.
No, and there isn't. There's a great one that just came out recently called Orion Lost, which is the same age group as mine, but it is a rarity, and I don't really know why that is. because
yeah, it's a bit odd actually when you think about like Star Wars as a film is aimed at kids originally anyway. And then there aren't books in that genre as well.
No, I'm not quite sure why, but
watch this space. There's going to be some big changes happening shortly.
You can be the trailblazer. Are there any plans that you're able to tell us about Orphans possibly being adapted into any other media?
I think it's still early days. I think what happens now is they try and sell the rights to like film production companies. But then even if you sell the rights, it might
nothing. It could just sit on a shelf. Yeah.
To see if anything happens. I think there's a lot of I think the rights then they go on a kind of game of table tennis where they get bounced about between companies. But yeah, it's all a bit beyond me, to be honest. I mean, my dream would be Studio Ghibli that do things. I think I'd love to see Orphans of the Tide done as a Studio Ghibli film.
I can see it actually working very well in that kind of anime style, kind of fantasy with imagery, or that you have in the book would work well on the screen like that. Yeah.
I think it would also make a great stage adaptation as well, but that's just my dream.
And are you still working at the moment as in the lab? Or are you?
Well, I'm not in the lab at the moment with all that's happening, but still. So I am a lecturer, so I'm going to be teaching online at the moment, and so balancing all of it can be a bit tricky. But
would you like to shift completely into the writing at some point, or would you like to still keep up in the lecturing world?
I think it's been really helpful to have a different thing, especially since writing is very solitary and it's very in your own head, and teaching in particular is a wonderful way to feel kind of connected to people again. So I think I'd always want to have something going on that allows me to, communicate with people, especially about something like science, which is very different, but which feels very kind of important. And I'll just keep, I've basically been a full-time academic all my life, so I don't just want that to kind of go away.
Yeah.
What was the last book that you read?
What was the last book? I'm really bad at. I always have about 5 different novels on the go in rotation. The last book that I finished was The Secret Starling, a children's novel. It's wonderful.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
And what was the last film you watched?
What was it? What's the last film I saw? I think it was the last Star Wars film. That's terrible. Yeah, I think it was the final Star Wars movie, which was just awful.
Yeah, I wasn't a massive fan of it myself, I have to say.
Yeah, I've still to see it, but I think I'll wait for TV. And last TV show or show that you're watching on TV at the moment?
Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Okay, yeah.
I've heard that's really good.
Really, really good.
Yeah, it's on my list.
The writing in that is just phenomenal as well.
Awesome. And very, very last thing is a quick fire either or. So just pick one. There's no right or wrong answer, perhaps. So Northern Lights on the BBC or the Golden Compass movie?
Oh, Northern Lights on the BBC.
I think that is a correct answer, to be fair.
Yeah.
A real book or an e-book?
Real book.
TV or cinema?
Cinema.
In a year's time, and this is all.
Yeah.
And another one for a year's time. A fancy restaurant or a takeaway?
Oh, takeaway.
Okay, nice one. Reading 5 novels on the go at once. That's how do you keep track of that? Have you ever done that?
I would struggle. No, I find if I have more than 2 open, I tend to just one gets left behind till I've finished everything else, and then I've kind of forget what it was I was actually reading in the first place.
Exactly. No, and it's you want to be pulled in by a novel, and then when you are,
yeah,
I find myself wanting to finish it. But obviously works for him.
When you go to bed at night, you've got 5 books on the bed table. How do you choose which one?
Exactly, I know.
That's like going on Netflix and spending about as long as a film trying to decide what to watch.
Exactly,
10 minutes of something.
Too much choice. Just give me the one book.
Exactly.
I can work through that.
Although audiobooks, I feel, are maybe the exception to that. I can't listen to an audiobook and read a book at the same time.
I suppose maybe having different narrators maybe helps, so it kind of distinguishes it, so you can immediately get back into what that person was last telling you.
Yeah.
I don't know. Struan did mention there that he just read The Secret Starling, and he couldn't remember the author. It was Judith Eagle, so check that out if you're interested in that. But huge thanks to Struan for taking the time to speak to us, especially during all of this madness that's going on in the world.
Yes.
Really appreciate him doing that, and really do recommend that you check out Orphans of the Tide, because it is a great book, and I think we'll be hearing a lot more from Struan in the future as well. Yeah,
I think he's definitely one to watch for sure.
Yeah. And so another one to watch, Derek, is our guest next week.
Oh, absolutely. Laura Lamb is on next week. She is a sci-fi author. She's also written some young adult fantasy as well in the past. But her new book is definitely sci-fi, and it's an excellent read. We've just finished reading it both ourselves, and it's highly. It comes out end of the month. Goldilocks is the name of it. She probably said that.
Goldilocks, yeah.
And it's a feminist sci-fi.
Yeah, I think she describes it as, and I think this is a good description actually, The Martian meets The Handmaid's Tale, which is a very good, concise description of it. And it's got aspects of Interstellar and Arrival as well in that sort of literary sci-fi, but very readable. You know what I mean?
It kind of hits a sweet spot for like a literary book for me in that it's really nice prose, and but it's not so too heavy with it. It's exactly it's really good.
It's great. So and we chatted to Laura a lot. She's also a tutor in creative writing. We chatted to her about that and what she teaches and stuff, which I think was really valuable, I thought, for me. I don't know about you, but so please do tune in for that one next week, which is going to be the last one in this season. But
season finale.
It is the big season finale, but don't worry, we're not going to be going for long. Given that everyone's trapped in their houses, we want to come back and keep you entertained. So
captive audience.
Exactly. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.